Have you ever stopped in the middle of an ordinary day and felt a quiet unease that you could not fully explain? As if something about your life was slightly off, not wrong enough to alarm you, but not right enough to satisfy you. And in that brief moment of awareness, you wondered, is this truly the life I chose? Or is this the life I was guided into before I even understood I had a choice? From the earliest stages of your life, before you had the language to question or the awareness to resist, a script was placed gently into your hands, not as a command, but as a suggestion, repeated so often that it became indistinguishable from truth. You were told to be responsible, to follow the path that had already been proven, to pursue stability above all else. And because it came from voices you trusted, from institutions that appeared legitimate, and from a society that rewarded compliance, you accepted it without resistance, believing that this path was not only safe, but correct. At first, everything seems to align with the promise. You learn, you progress, you achieve the milestones that signal you are moving in the right direction. And there is a certain comfort in knowing that you are doing what is expected of you. But beneath that comfort, something begins to fade so gradually that it is almost invisible. The sense of direction that comes from within, the quiet conviction that your life is moving towards something meaningful, something personal, something that belongs to you and not to the expectations of others. Instead, what replaces? It is a different kind of momentum, one driven not by purpose but by habit, not by vision but by repetition. You wake up, you move, you respond, you perform, and over time, these actions become so familiar that they no longer feel like choices. They feel like necessities, and when something feels necessary, it is rarely questioned. This is how the script maintains its power, not through force, but through normalization. It does not need to control you directly, because it shapes the environment in which you think, and by shaping your thinking, it shapes your decisions. And by shaping your decisions, it quietly determines the direction of your life without ever appearing to do so. You begin to measure your progress by standards that were never designed to reflect your true potential. You compare yourself based on timelines that were never tailored to your path, and you define success using metrics that reward consistency over creativity, predictability over possibility. And over time, you adapt so well to this system that you forget there was ever an alternative, but there is always a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes sudden, when the illusion weakens just enough for you to see through it. It might come during a quiet evening when the noise fades and your thoughts become louder, or in a moment of exhaustion when the effort you are giving no longer feels connected to any meaningful outcome. And in that moment, a question emerges, not from fear, but from awareness. Is this all there is? This question is not a sign of dissatisfaction. It is a sign of awakening, because for the first time, you are not reacting, you are observing. And that shift, though small, changes everything, because observation creates distance, and distance allows clarity. And clarity reveals something that was always there but rarely seen, that much of what you believed to be your path was actually inherited, absorbed, and accepted without conscious agreement. You were not forced into it. You were guided into it. And guidance, when repeated often enough, becomes indistinguishable from choice, and that is why most people never recognize it as a script at all. They call it reality. They call it responsibility. They call it life. And they continue to move within it without ever asking who wrote it. Yet if you look closely, you will begin to notice patterns that are too consistent to be coincidence. Generations following nearly identical trajectories, exchanging time for security, energy for stability, dreams for predictability. And while some find moments of satisfaction within this structure, many reach a point where they realize that what they have built does not fully reflect who they are. They followed every instruction. They did what was expected. They avoided unnecessary risk. And still, something feels incomplete. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded at something that was never truly aligned with them in the first place. This is the hidden cost of living a life that was designed externally. You can achieve within it. You can progress within it. You can even excel within it. But if it is not rooted in your own defined purpose, it will always feel like something is missing, like you are participating in a life rather than creating one. And this is where most people stop. Because recognizing the script is uncomfortable, it introduces uncertainty. It challenges the foundation of what you have built. And it raises a question that demands courage to answer. If this path is not entirely mine, then what is? To ask that question is to step outside the script, even if only for a moment. And that moment is more powerful than it appears, because it represents the beginning of authorship, the shift from being directed to directing, from following to defining, from reacting to choosing. But awareness alone is not enough, because the script does not disappear the moment you see it. It continues through habit, through environment, through expectation. And if left unchallenged, it will pull you back into its rhythm, not out of malice, but out of familiarity. This is why most awakenings fade, not because they were false, but because they were not reinforced. They were moments of clarity without action, insights without structure, and without structure, even the strongest realization cannot sustain itself against the weight of routine. So the question is not whether you can see the script. The question is whether you are willing to step beyond it, not in a dramatic act of rebellion, but in a deliberate process of redefinition, where you begin to examine not just what you do, but why you do it, not just where you are going, but who decided that direction. Because the moment you begin to question the origin of your choices, you reclaim something that was always yours but rarely used with intention. The ability to define your own path, not based on fear, not based on expectation, but based on a clear and deliberate understanding of what you are here to do. And once that process begins, even quietly, even imperfectly, something shifts within you. The things that once felt normal begin to feel misaligned. The habits that once felt automatic begin to feel optional. And the life you are living starts to reveal itself not as a fixed reality, but as a structure that can be changed, redesigned, and rebuilt from the inside out. The script you were given may have shaped your beginning, but it does not have to define your direction. And the realization of that truth, once fully accepted, carries a weight that cannot be ignored, because it leaves you with a responsibility that cannot be transferred. If your life is not predetermined, then it is yours to decide. And that decision, whether made consciously or not, is shaping everything that follows. Look at the life most people around you are living, not what they say about it, not what they post, but the rhythm of their days, the weight in their eyes, the quiet fatigue that never quite leaves. And ask yourself one simple question. If this path is truly safe, then why does it cost so much of who they are? You were taught to chase security as if it were the highest form of success, to believe that a predictable life is a good life, that stability is something to be protected at all costs, and that the safest choice is always the smartest one. Yet no one paused long enough to explain what that safety actually demands in return, because every form of security comes with a price. And in this case, the price is often paid in silence, over years, through habits that slowly disconnect you from your own potential. At first, the trade feels reasonable. You give your time, and in return, you receive income. structure, a sense of direction, and that exchange appears fair, even beneficial, because it removes uncertainty. It provides clarity. It tells you exactly what to do and when to do it. But what it also does, quietly and consistently, is condition you to operate within limits that were never designed for expansion, only for continuation. You begin to associate safety with repetition. You start to believe that doing the same thing over and over again is not only normal, but necessary. And the more you repeat it, the more natural it feels, until one day you no longer recognize that it was ever a choice at all. It has become your identity, your routine, your default way of existing, and this is where obedience takes its true form, not as submission, but as agreement, a silent agreement to follow patterns you did not create, to accept timelines you did not design, to measure your progress using standards that were handed to you without explanation. And because everyone around you is operating within the same structure, it reinforces the illusion that this is simply how life works. But if you step back, even briefly, you begin to notice something unsettling. The system you trusted for safety does not actually produce freedom. It produces dependency. It keeps you functional, but rarely fulfilled. It rewards consistency, but not necessarily creativity. And most importantly, it keeps you occupied enough that you rarely question where it is all leading. You are told that if you stay long enough, if you endure, if you remain patient, eventually you will reach a point where you can rest, where you can finally enjoy the life you have been building. Yet for many, that moment arrives with a strange realization. The energy they once had is gone. The curiosity that once drove them has faded, and the freedom they imagined feels distant, not because it is impossible, but because they have spent so long adapting to a system that never required them to define it for themselves. The most dangerous aspect of this kind of safety is not that it restricts you, but that it feels reasonable. It feels responsible. It feels like the right thing to do. And because of that, you defend it. You justify it. You protect it. Even when it begins to cost you more than it gives you, you start to avoid risk, not because it is inherently harmful, but because you have been conditioned to associate uncertainty with danger, and in doing so, you unknowingly close yourself off from the very experiences that lead to growth, to expansion, to transformation. Because every meaningful shift in life requires stepping into something that is not yet guaranteed. Instead, you remain within the boundaries, refining what already exists, improving within a structure that was never meant to elevate you beyond a certain level, and while you may become more efficient, more reliable, more consistent, you rarely become something fundamentally different, because transformation does not happen inside comfort. It happens at the edge of it. Over time, obedience reshapes not just your actions, but your thinking. You begin to doubt ideas that do not fit within the accepted framework. You question your own ambitions before they have a chance to develop, and you lower your expectations, not because you lack ability, but because you have adapted to a system that does not reward those who think beyond it. And so a quiet resignation begins to form, not dramatic, not obvious, but persiste. A subtle acceptance that this is simply how things are, that this is what life requires, and that anything beyond it is unrealistic, unnecessary, or too risky to pursue. But beneath that acceptance, something continues to resist. So part of you that recognizes that safety without growth is not true security, it is stagnation. That a life built entirely on avoiding risk is a life that slowly avoids possibility, and that obedience, when left unquestioned, becomes a pattern that limits not just what you do, but what you believe you are capable of. The truth is, safety is not inherently wrong. Structure is not inherently limiting. Discipline is not inherently restrictive. But when they are pursued without awareness, without intention, without a clearly defined purpose, they become tools that maintain a life you did not consciously choose. And once you begin to see that, even slightly, even imperfectly, the definition of safety starts to change. It is no longer about avoiding uncertainty. It becomes about building something strong enough that uncertainty no longer controls you. It is no longer about following a path that has already been proven. It becomes about creating one that aligns with who you are becoming. Because the real risk is not stepping outside the system. The real risk is spending your entire life inside it without ever asking whether it was designed for you in the first place. Pay attention to what controls your decisions. Not the obvious constraints that you can see and name, but the quiet forces that shape your behavior without asking for permission, the habits you repeat without questioning, the comforts you defend without examining, and the beliefs you carry that were never consciously chosen. Because it is within these unseen patterns that the strongest limitations are formed. Nothing about your current life is random. Every reaction, every hesitation, every compromise is connected to something deeper, something that has been reinforced over time until it feels natural. And what feels natural is rarely challenged, even when it quietly holds you in place. Because the most effective chains are not the ones you struggle against. They are the ones you no longer notice. Ease is one of the most powerful of these chains, not because it appears harmful, but because it feels deserved. It feels like relief, like reward, like something you have earned after effort, and in small doses. It is harmless, even necessary. But when ease becomes the default, when comfort replaces challenge, when convenience replaces intention, something begins to shift within you. Your tolerance for discomfort decreases. Your willingness to push beyond familiar limits fades. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to choose what is easy over what is meaningful. This is how potential is quietly traded away, not in dramatic decisions, but in small, repeated choices. The decision to delay, to avoid, to stay within what feels manageable. And each time that decision is made, it reinforces a pattern, teaching your mind that growth is optional, that effort can be postponed, that discipline is negotiable, and over time, these patterns accumulate into a way of living that feels stable but produces very little transformation. At the same time, another layer of control begins to form, one that is less visible but far more binding, and that is debt. Not only in the financial sense, but in the psychological sense, the commitments you make, the obligations you accept, the lifestyle you maintain, all of which create a structure that demands consistency, not because it serves your growth, but because it must be sustained. Financial debt ties your time to external demands. It requires you to continue operating within the same system regardless of how you feel about it. Because stepping away is no longer a simple decision. It becomes a risk you cannot afford to take. And in this way, what was once a choice becomes a necessity. And necessity removes freedom. Not completely, but enough to make change feel distant, complicated, and unrealistic. But even more limiting than financial debt is the weight of borrowed beliefs, the ideas you accepted without examination, the assumptions you internalized because they were repeated often enough, the quiet rules about what is possible, what is realistic, what is too ambitious, and what is simply not for someone like you. These beliefs do not arrive as restrictions, they arrive as guidance, as advice, as protection. And because they often come from people you trust, You rarely question them. You adopt them. You build your expectations around them. And over time, they shape the way you see yourself and the world around you. You begin to filter your decisions through these beliefs, not consciously, but automatically. You dismiss opportunities before exploring them. You doubt your own ideas before developing them, and you limit your vision to what feels acceptable within the framework you have been given. And in doing so, you unknowingly confine yourself to a version of life that is far smaller than what you are capable of creating. The combination of ease, debt, and borrowed beliefs forms a system of control that does not need to be enforced, because it is maintained internally by your habits, your fears, your assumptions, and your desire to remain within what feels familiar. And because it operates from within, it is rarely recognized as something that can be changed. You may believe that external circumstances are what hold you back, that if certain conditions were different, you would act differently, think differently, pursue something greater. But in reality, those external circumstances are often reflections of internal patterns that have been repeated long enough to shape your environment, your choices, and your results. This is why change feels so difficult. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires more than a shift in action. It requires a shift in identity, a willingness to question not just what you do, but what you believe, not just what you have, but why you continue to maintain it, even when it no longer aligns with who you are becoming. Most people never reach this point of awareness. They continue to operate within the same patterns, adjusting slightly, improving incrementally, but never fundamentally changing, because true change requires discomfort, and discomfort challenges the very systems they have built their lives around. Yet for those who begin to see these invisible chains clearly, something changes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The things that once felt automatic begin to feel optional. The beliefs that once felt true begin to feel questionable. And the comforts that once felt necessary begin to feel limiting. You start to recognize that ease, when unchecked, weakens your capacity to grow. That debt, when unmanaged, restricts your ability to choose. And that beliefs, when borrowed without examination, shape a reality that was never consciously designed by you. And in that recognition, a new possibility begins to emerge. The possibility that your current limitations are not permanent, not fixed, not inevitable, but constructed, reinforced, and therefore capable of being dismantled and rebuilt in a way that aligns with something greater. Because once you see the chains, they lose their invisibility. And once they lose their invisibility, they can no longer control you in the same way. And while they may still exist, their influence begins to weaken the moment you stop accepting them as truth. The question is no longer whether these forces are present in your life. The question is whether you are willing to confront them, to challenge them, and ultimately, to move beyond them, even when doing so requires you to step into discomfort, uncertainty, and the unfamiliar space where real transformation begins. Think back to the first time you had an idea that felt bigger than your current reality. Something bold, something undefined, something that did not come with guarantees. And notice what happened next. Not outside of you, but within you. Because before the world had a chance to respond, a quieter voice appeared. A voice that questioned, that hesitated, that asked whether you were capable, whether it was realistic, whether you should even try. And that voice did not come from nowhere. It was learned, repeated, reinforced until it became part of the way you think. From the beginning, your mind was not trained to expand without limits. It was trained to operate within boundaries, to prioritize correctness over curiosity, to seek approval over exploration. And while these patterns were presented as education, as discipline, as preparation for life, they carried an unintended consequence. They gradually shifted your focus from what is possible to what is acceptable. You learn to look for the right answer instead of creating new ones, to follow instructions instead of questioning them, to avoid mistakes instead of learning from them. And in doing so, you developed a habit of thinking that relies on external validation, because when every step is evaluated, graded, and judged, you begin to measure your worth based on how well you meet expectations rather than how boldly you pursue your own ideas. This is where doubt begins to take root, not as a sudden force, but as a slow accumulation of moments where your instinct was overridden by instruction, where your curiosity was replaced by caution, where your imagination was adjusted to fit within what could be explained, proven, or approved. And over time, these adjustments shape the way you perceive your own potential. You begin to believe that confidence must come before action, that certainty is required before commitment, and that without clear evidence, you should not move forward. Yet this belief contradicts the nature of every meaningful achievement, because anything that has not yet been done will always lack evidence in the beginning. And waiting for proof before acting ensures that you remain exactly where you are. The mind, when conditioned in this way, becomes reactive rather than creative. It analyzes instead of initiates. It hesitates instead of commits. And it seeks reassurance instead of building conviction. And while this may protect you from failure in the short term, it also prevents you from accessing the deeper levels of your own capability. What makes this pattern even more powerful is that it feels logical, it feels responsible, it feels like intelligence because you are not acting impulsively. You are evaluating, you are considering, you are thinking carefully. But beneath that careful thinking lies a limitation, a dependence on external confirmation that delays action indefinitely. You may tell yourself that you are waiting for the right moment, for the right conditions, for the right level of readiness, but in reality, you are waiting for a sense of certainty that rarely arrives on its own. Because certainty is not something that appears before action. It is something that develops through action, through repetition, through experience that gradually replaces doubt with evidence. The longer you remain in this state of hesitation, the more it reinforces itself. Each delay strengthens the belief that you are not ready. Each missed opportunity confirms the idea that you should wait longer. And over time, so this pattern becomes so familiar that it defines your behavior without you even recognizing it. At the same time, you are surrounded by signals that reinforce this doubt, comparisons that highlight what others have achieved, expectations that suggest where you should be, narratives that define success in ways that feel distant or unattainable. And instead of using these signals as inspiration, your conditioned mind interprets them as evidence that you are behind, that you are lacking, that you are not yet capable of stepping into something greater. This is how the mind learns to underestimate itself, not because it lacks ability, but because it has been trained to question that ability before it has a chance to develop. And once that pattern is established, it influences every decision, every risk, every attempt to move beyond what is familiar. You begin to filter your ambitions through doubt, reducing them to what feels achievable rather than what is truly possible. And in doing so, you create a version of your life that is manageable, predictable, and limited, not because you intended it to be, but because your thinking has been shaped to avoid anything that cannot be immediately justified. Yet beneath this conditioning, something remains unchanged. The capacity of your mind to imagine, to create, to direct itself toward a goal that has not yet been realized. And this capacity does not disappear. It becomes dormant, waiting for a moment of recognition, a moment where you begin to see that the doubt you experience is not a reflection of your true limits, but a result of patterns that can be changed. When you begin to understand this, the nature of your thoughts starts to shift. You no longer accept every hesitation as truth. You begin to question the origin of your doubt. You start to notice that many of your limitations are assumptions rather than facts. And this awareness creates space between thought and action, space where a different choice becomes possible. Instead of waiting for confidence, you begin to act despite uncertainty. Instead of seeking validation, you begin to trust your own direction. And instead of measuring your potential by past results, you begin to define it by what you are willing to pursue consistently over time. This is where the true power of the mind begins to emerge, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual reconditioning, where repeated action reshapes belief, where disciplined thought replaces automatic doubt, and where identity shifts from someone who hesitates to someone who moves with intention, even when the outcome is not guaranteed, because the mind was trained to doubt, but it can also be trained to believe. And the difference between the two is not ability, it is direction, it is repetition. It is the decision to no longer let inherited patterns define what you consider possible, and when that decision is made, even quietly, even imperfectly, the same mind that once limited you becomes the very tool that expands your life beyond anything you were previously willing to imagine. Walk through the structure of modern life carefully, and you begin to notice a pattern that feels too precise to be accidental. A sequence that takes a young, curious mind and gradually reshapes it into something efficient, predictable, and compliant. Not broken, not incapable, but directed toward a very specific role, one that fits neatly into an existing system rather than challenges or expands it. You are placed into environments where success is clearly defined and tightly measured, where the highest reward goes, not to the one who thinks differently, but to the one who follows instructions most accurately, completes tasks most consistently, and avoids mistakes most effectively. And over time, this creates a powerful association between obedience and progress, between conformity and achievement. At first, it feels like growth, because you are learning, you are advancing, you are being recognized for your effort, but what is rarely acknowledged is the type of growth being reinforced. It is not the growth of independent thinking. It is not the growth of bold decision-making. It is the refinement of your ability to operate within a framework that has already been established. You learn how to meet expectations, but not how to define them. You learn how to execute plans, but not how to create them. And most importantly, you learn how to seek approval before you trust your own judgment, because every step along the way has been evaluated by someone else. This conditioning does not end when formal education does. It evolves. It follows you into the next phase of life, where the structure becomes more complex, but the principle remains the same. You exchange your time and effort for compensation. You are given responsibilities that must be fulfilled, and in return, you receive stability, predictability, and a clear sense of what is required of you. And again, it appears reasonable, it appears fair, because there is a direct exchange taking place, but beneath that exchange lies a limitation that is rarely addressed. You are rewarded for maintaining the system, not for redesigning it. You are encouraged to improve efficiency, not to question the structure itself. You become skilled at operating within boundaries. You learn how to optimize processes, how to increase output, how to manage time. And these are valuable abilities, but they are applied within a context that rarely allows for true autonomy. Because the direction is still externally defined, the goals are still externally set, and the outcome, no matter how refined, still belongs to a system that is not entirely yours. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in identity. You no longer see yourself as someone who creates value independently. You begin to see yourself as someone who contributes value within a predefined structure, and while this may provide security, it also limits the scope of what you believe is possible for yourself. You begin to think in terms of roles rather than possibilities, positions rather than purpose, responsibilities rather than vision. And the more you adapt to this way of thinking, the more difficult it becomes to imagine a different way of operating, because your reference point has been shaped by the system itself. This is why many people feel a sense of hesitation when they consider stepping outside of it. Not because they lack ability, but because they have not been trained to trust that ability without external direction. They have spent years refining their capacity to follow, but very little time developing their capacity to build who. A builder operates differently. A builder does not wait for instructions. They define objectives. They do not rely on external validation to begin. They move with conviction, even when the path is not fully visible. And most importantly, they understand that value is not something assigned to them. It is something they create and control. But this way of thinking is rarely cultivated in environments that prioritize stability. Because true building requires uncertainty, it requires initiative, it requires a willingness to operate without guarantees. And these qualities are difficult to standardize, difficult to measure, and therefore often discouraged in systems that depend on consistency. So instead, you are taught to minimize risk, to stay within proven methods, to follow processes that have already been validated. And while this approach produces reliable results, it also produces a ceiling, a limit to how far you can expand within that structure, because you are operating within rules that you did not design. You may advance within the system. You may gain more responsibility, more recognition, more compensation. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Your time is still exchanged, your direction is still guided, and your capacity to build something entirely your own remains underdeveloped, not because it is absent, but because it has not been exercised. And this is where a deeper realization begins to form, one that is not immediately comfortable, but necessary, that the system you trusted to provide growth was never designed to create builders. It was designed to create participants, individuals who can sustain and improve what already exists, but not necessarily redefine it. This does not mean the system is inherently wrong. It means it is incomplete. It serves a function, but it does not fulfill the full potential of those who operate within it. And if you rely on it entirely to define your path, you will inherit its limitations along with its benefits. The question then becomes not whether you should reject the system entirely, but whether you are willing to see beyond it, to recognize that your ability to create, to design, to build something independent of predefined structures is a skill that must be developed intentionally, not something that emerges automatically from participation. Because the moment you begin to shift from operating within systems to understanding how they are built, something changes in the way you think. You start to see opportunities where others see routines. You begin to recognize patterns that can be improved, expanded, or replaced. And most importantly, you start to realize that your value is not limited to how well you perform tasks, but extends to how effectively you can create systems that produce results beyond your direct effort. And that realization, once fully understood, makes it impossible to view your life in the same way again. Because you are no longer just a part of a structure. You are someone who can shape it. And the difference between those two perspectives defines the difference between a life of participation and a life of creation. Every attempt to change your life eventually collides with something that feels invisible but incredibly strong. Not a lack of opportunity, not a lack of knowledge, but a resistance that comes from within. A quiet force that pulls you back toward what is familiar, even when you know it no longer serves you. And this is where most people misunderstand the nature of transformation. They believe the struggle is external, when in reality, it is deeply internal. A conflict between who you have been conditioned to be and who you are capable of becoming